Hello, it's Anton. Welcome to Mod Reviews. Today I'm going to be doing one of my last purely graphical mods, and this one is the Ultimate Portraits mod. I'm going to go through each faction with different portraits and give my thoughts on if I think the mod works or not. There are a few races I haven't included because this mod doesn't change any of their appearances. Let's start with the Beastman. Kazrak the One-Eye's portrait looks pretty similar, except it has an open mouth. I don't particularly think either one is better than the other. Malagor the Dark Omen, again, doesn't have too much difference. He's facing right instead of left. Morgor the Shadowgave is essentially the exact same. It's a little bit darker and more realistic looking on the right here. Torox the Brass Bull is the one where there's really a big difference. I actually prefer the vanilla version because it's easier to see. I understand the modded version is a little bit darker and more realistic looking, but I prefer the vanilla version. Moving on to Britannia, the difference between Luon Leoncoeur and the vanilla and the modded version is essentially if he's looking at you or not. I think that this portrait is a little bit better here. Alberic has very little difference. Again, a little bit more realistic looking here, but I actually prefer the vanilla version. The Enchantress, I basically think these two are equivalent. She looks a little bit better here, perhaps. And Rapunzel looks very similar, and this is one where I do prefer the modded version. Moving on to the Dark Elves, they look a little bit darker and more intimidating. And this is one of the rare ones where I think essentially across the board, all of the modded versions are better. Malekith looks way more intimidating. I really like this Crone Hellebron one. Lockyer Fellheart looks absolutely savage. Malus Darkblade looks really intimidating, and Rakarth looks much cooler. So if you're playing Dark Elves, I really would recommend using the mod. Moving on to the Dwarfs, not a huge difference in between the two. Thorgrim is essentially just as zoomed in. Ungrim Ironfist has a little bit more zoomed in of a beard. I will say Belagar Ironhammer looks quite a bit better in the modded version. One of the themes is that the modded version tends to look quite a bit more realistic. Same with Grumbrindle. I think that this looks more like a drawing and this looks more like an actual being. And same thing with Thorak here. This looks a little bit more realistic, so I'd say a slight preference for the modded version. Here we have the Empire. Once again, the theme, they all look pretty similar with the exception that the modded versions look a touch more realistic. Particularly, I think Karl Franz looks much better here. For Cathay, the Miao Ying portraits look pretty similar to me with the exception of the angle, so I don't necessarily have a preference there, but for Zhao Ming, I think that the modded version is far superior. Going on to the Greenskins, my favorite. I think once again, this is clear where for the most part, the mod is better. Grimgor here looks much more intimidating and less cartoonish. Azag has these glowing green eyes and doesn't look quite as distorted in the face as in the vanilla version. Skarsnik looks much the same, but a little bit more zoomed in and realistic. Warzag definitely looks better. Actually, Grom the Paunch looks pretty close. Moving on to the High Elves, it's essentially the same sort of feedback as the previous ones where en masse the High Elf modded portraits look better and more realistic. I think particularly Alariel the Radiant has one of the best upgrades here. She looks more defined and more elegant like she is in lore. I also really like the changes to a Lithonar. Scarbrand, not a huge difference. The modded one I would say maybe I have a slight preference for just because this red is sort of cartoonish looking and this one is a more dynamic picture. Kislev, there's essentially no difference, but I do think Katerin looks much better in the modded version. Kostalton looks like a bum in both, and Boris looks pretty similar in each one. Lizardmen have the most lords in the game right now, so this is where I think the mod really shines. Mazdamundi goes from a derpy looking open fish mouth to this intense glowing-eyed slan. Krokar actually looks pretty similar to Henowin, much better and more realistic. Tic-Tac-Toe I actually think is pretty good in the vanilla game, but the modded version also looks excellent. Gorok I think looks absolutely savage in the modded version. Nakai the Wanderer, same thing. Oxyotl looks pretty much the same in both. I think both Oxyotl portraits are pretty good. Moving on to Norska, this is one where I think the modded portraits are very clearly better. Particularly Throg, again, looks more realistic and less like a drawing. On to Ogre Kingdoms, these are very, very similar. I would say that Scrag the Slaughterer looks grosser in the mod than in vanilla, so I guess that means it's better. Moving on to the Skaven, the vanilla Skaven portraits are so good that essentially all the mod does is sort of standardize them and make them look a little bit more realistic. But I think overall it really works. Particularly, I like Queek Headtaker's portrait. Seems a lot more intimidating now that he's looking more at you. You also have the changes with Tretch Craventail and Deathmaster Snitch having their mouths open and look a little bit more combat ready. Moving on to Slaanesh, I think both of these portraits are really good. I don't really have a strong preference preference either way. The Tomb Kings is another one where I think the modded portraits are strictly superior. The difference between, for example, this iteration of Ark in the Black where the eyes look dead to this iteration where there's the strong contrast with the necromantic lighting versus the blue lights of the other Tomb Kings, I think is really, really excellent. The actual posing is pretty similar, except for Cetra, and again, I think that the Cetra portrait in the mod is much better. For Cich, there's really not too much difference. Both of them are sort of difficult to parse because Kairos Fateweaver does have two heads, so you could go either way on that one. Vampire Coast, again, they're all pretty similar to the vanilla game. They're all zoomed in a little bit more. I think Noctilus has the best makeover in the modded version. This looks a lot more intimidating than this with his weird chin thingy here. On to the vampire counts. I think this is another example where the vampire counts in general benefit from the mod. With the exception of Manfred and Vlad von Karstein, I actually think their vanilla portraits look a little better just because this Vlad portrait is a little bit blurry and not that nice. But I think the Isabella von Karstein looks really good. Gorst is a really nice upgrade. Kemmler basically just looks a little bit more realistic, but it's a good change as well. Two factions left, on to the Warriors of Chaos. There are some that are obviously the same, like Festus here, but I think the two standouts are definitely Archaon the Everchosen. This looks way, way better, and Bellicor. This looks like the first Demon Prince, something that is really intimidating. There are some minor changes. Azazel, I could go either way. Vilch is pretty good. Holek, again, it's just sort of more realistic. Same with Sigvald. And now finally on to the Wood Elves. It's essentially just making them look more realistic. Nothing has changed all that much, but I will say the Durthu and Drycha portraits especially get a lot of benefit, where these seem a lot more dynamic and the glow is a lot more obvious. I think this is a solid mod. There are a few portraits that I think are a little bit shaky and are better in the vanilla version, but overall, I'm probably going to be playing with this mod going forward because I think for the vast majority of portraits, they're either the same quality in the mod or a bit better quality. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked the video, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment if there's other mods you want to see reviewed, and feel free to check out the next video, which should be on screen now.